Stephen Bernstein, Global Chair of McDermott's Health Industry Practice Group. I'm pleased to present our monthly podcast, Governing Health, geared towards director education. The goal of this series is to supplement the education that directors receive in the boardroom by providing them with concise updates on leading developments and engaging conversations with industry guests that relate to the exercise of their fiduciary duties. On behalf of the Health Industry Practice Group at McDermott, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Hello again, and welcome. I'm your host, Michael Peregrine. We're pleased you're with us. Today's conversation focuses on a critical but often overlooked aspect of the duty of care, the obligation to monitor prevailing economic conditions. Directors must understand their implications for both the healthcare industry in general and your health system in particular. Part of that involves keeping a finger on the pulse of the job market and what hiring trends are suggesting. What do they tell us about financial conditions? About what business sectors are creating the most jobs? What do hiring and job loss indicators suggest? What are the related connections to strategy? And what is the relationship between jobs data and the board's obligation for talent development? So today we're going to explore this key governance duty with the prominent industry expert, John Challenger, the CEO of global consultancy Challenger, Gray & Christmas. As some of you probably know, Challenger Gray provides high-end outplacement support to executives who depart from their companies and to the individuals at all levels, exempt and non-exempt, who lose their jobs in downsizings, layoffs, and business restructurings. The company also provides executive coaching for C-suite, middle management, and high-potential leaders. A recognized thought leader on workplace, labor, and economic issues, John's insight is often sought out by major foreign and domestic broadcast and print media. Indeed, I'll bet you've heard him on NPR or seen him on the Today Show. John's also a longtime friend. But before we turn to John, let's revisit for a second our conversation last month about board oversight of executive compensation. In the last several weeks, there's been quite a bit of media and regulatory focus on two particular areas. First, significant coverage on the reasonableness of compensation, which implicates the Executive Compensation Committee process and the committee's exercise of business judgment. Second, continuing developments on how compensation is being used more broadly to drive executive and employee behavior, incentivize conduct, and penalize performance that falls short of board expectations. These are issues squarely in the ambit of the Executive Compensation Committee, which can look to both the General Counsel and the CHRO for related information and guidance. And now John Challenger of Challenger, Gray & Christmas. John, welcome again. John, I think you know that many of the board members listening today are either on the board's strategic planning committee or on its finance committee. From an economic performance perspective, from a jobs creation, jobs loss perspective, to what extent should these two committees be coordinating their discussions and their planning and their effort?
Jobs data is right at the core of what's going on in the economy. It's like the canary in the coal mine. It can tell these committees what is happening not only in the economy, but what's happening particularly in the healthcare sector, and in some cases into specific areas, ambulatory care, nursing homes, various areas of the healthcare sector where the jobs are being created, where it's slowing. And so watching this data carefully month by month is a window into what might be happening to competitors throughout the industry.
In terms of the data that's available, would it require much extrapolation for executive leadership to get it to a level where the board as a whole or key committees can understand it? What's your experience with board committees reviewing jobs creation data and making some sense out of it?
The best places to find jobs data is the federal government's BLS report on unemployment that comes out on the first Friday of every month. It gives a immediate window into what happened the previous month. It does get revised over the next 2 months, but it's generally very accurate. It's what the stock market reacts to. So looking at some of the core numbers in that data month by month or quarter by quarter at the board meetings can give the board a good feel for what's happening in the economic landscape as it relates to healthcare.
All right, let me put your thinking cap on this one. We obviously try to reduce or protect against an overflow of information going to the board and its key committees. It seems to me that the Strategic Planning Committee of the board, the Finance Committee, and the HR Committee all have some claim to receiving this type of data. If you were orchestrating the board agenda and the flow of information, where would you want to send this type of jobs data? Would you want them to have it on a monthly basis? What, in your experience, is the best flow of information, and to what segments of the board should that flow be directed?
I would look at this data on a quarter-by-quarter basis so that the board could look at, from a strategic standpoint and from a HR standpoint, around talent management, just how tight or loose the pool of people is at any given time. So, for example, right now, we've seen in the last year the number of unemployed people in healthcare and education, they lumped that together in this particular stat, has dropped from 751,000 down to 623,000. Unemployment rate in this particular sector has dropped from 3.2% down to 2.7%. That is the epitome of a sector that is at not only full employment, but past full employment. There's just hardly anybody out there. We're at 4.8% right now nationally, and many economists feel that's full employment. In fact, it's this stat of 2.7% unemployment in the healthcare sector is similar to what you see for education type stats. If someone has less than a college degree, unemployment can run anywhere from 3.8% with a little bit up to 7.7% with less than a high school diploma. But if you have a college degree or higher, unemployment's at 2.5%. It means there's just no college graduates really out there looking right now. They're moving from job to job, and that accounts for that number. The same thing's happening in healthcare. So my guess is that most CHROs in your hospitals or in your healthcare organizations are having a very difficult time finding the skilled people they need.
Is there a good resource available to the board that provides the kind of commentary that goes with this numbers, something that the CFO or the Chief Human Resources Officer can distribute with this kind of data so that their board members know what to look for or have some type of benchmark against which they review the data?
Probably the two best reports to look at what's happening in the labor markets, especially as it relates to healthcare, is the monthly unemployment report and the WARN notices that are more local, put out state by state in your area. Someone would need then to compile them on the board or on the Strategic Planning Committee so that the board could understand how they're moving from quarter to quarter.
It seems like a worthy effort by staff to these committees to work together to prepare that information, and perhaps it could be shared equally between the key committees that have an interest in this kind of information. Let's pivot for a moment to our regular short segment, What's Trending Now?, when we try and flag a new governance issue we see on the horizon. And today, we want to note the increasing emphasis of the government on the board's duty to make sure the health system has an effective compliance program. Just a few weeks ago, the Department of Justice released very practical guidance on factors it considers when evaluating the effectiveness of a corporation's compliance program. Now, that guidance is not specific to the health industry, but it provides an exceptionally practical set of benchmarks against which the Audit and Compliance Committee, in consultation with the General Counsel and the Chief Compliance Officer, can evaluate the effectiveness of the health system's compliance program. This new guidance should be at the top of the Audit and Compliance Committee's next meeting agenda, even if it's just used to kick the tires a bit to see how well the current program is working. And now, back to the show. And now let's turn back to our conversation with John Challenger of Challenger, Gray & Christmas, where we're discussing with John the importance of board oversight of economic trends and jobs data. John, the boards of many of our healthcare clients are struggling right now with issues of change and volatility in the market and their related fiduciary responsibilities. What's your take on the general economy and its stability and where it's headed?
The economy has been growing now since 2010. In fact, we've seen 76 months of continuous job creation. That's a record. Unemployment right now is at 4.8%. We saw 227,000 jobs created last month. The unemployment rate, the number of unemployed people is down now at 7.6 million. So generally, the economy is in very good shape. We are probably in the seventh or eighth inning of this long expansion. So there is a recession on the horizon. We don't know when that's going to come. In fact, there seems to still be room in the number of unemployed people. Often you see recessions occur when all of a sudden there just really aren't any more people to employ. There does still seem to be room in some of the people who've stopped looking for work, but we're getting close to the point where unemployment can't continue to go down.
John, I think I'm thinking of a lot of our directors are picking up the paper these days and worried about where the Affordable Care Act is going. And now all of a sudden you're injecting another concern into them. Tell me a little bit more about your concerns about recession, because we're picking up the paper every day and seeing continued good news about a gung-ho economy. But for purposes of our discussion today, I think our directors are going to want to plumb a little bit more with you on your thoughts about a recession, what that could mean, and the extent to which they have to factor that into their planning.
It does seem that this is a time when you'd begin to be more cautious about some of your expansion plans. Not only is there a lot of uncertainty on the regulatory front, but the economy has been growing, like I'd said, for quite a while. So certainly there's potential that if the Fed decides to raise interest rates, they're now signaling they're going to start doing that. That'll begin to slow the economy down. We've got to, from the Fed standpoint, get some ammunition for when the recession does occur so they can lower interest rates and kind of stir the economy back up. So it does look as though certainly recession, it's not anytime soon. In fact, with the new administration, the fiscal stimulus plans they have to spend money on infrastructure certainly might push that recession out a bit, but it's not that far away.
So it's not whether, it's just when. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that's right. And always at the beginning of a period of recession, companies, organizations don't recognize that recession's there. So we always see this period where the economy kind of hurdles into recession. Companies keep hiring, they hire too much, and then the recession hits, and then they've got to deal with the consequences of those actions.
Let me ask you a related question. A number of the people listening to you today are either on the board's strategic planning committee or on its finance committee. To what extent do these concerns about the economy and recession relate to the agenda of these committees in your experience? Should they be talking together? Should they be coordinating? How would you advise them as they consider some of the advice you're giving us today?
Well, certainly when you're thinking from a strategic standpoint of where you want the organization to be in 5 years and some of the plans you put into effect, capital spending plans, whether it's on buildings or technology, those are big capital expenditures for organizations. So in a time of maybe more caution as you get near a recession, the companies I think that are careful about that don't, again, kind of rush into the recession, don't find themselves, out kind of over their skis when that recession hits, are in better shape. So at the beginning of a period of expansion, that's when you make your big changes. That's when you start to grow because you're trying to catch that wave. But we're certainly now 6 years into this expansion at a time where more caution probably is required. And we talked a little bit about some of the regulatory concerns. We saw a big increase in spending the nation's healthcare sector spent $3.2 trillion in 2015. That was up 5.8% from the year before because of the expansions due to ACA. And yet we may see some of that now pull back as the administration starts to think and Congress starts to think about not supporting healthcare in quite the way the last administration expected to do.
Before we start turning to the jobs data, I want to come back on one other point. Some of our clients, because of the uncertainty of the ACA and where that's going and the whole healthcare financing model, are limiting their strategic plan to 3 years as opposed to 5 years. Is there a risk when your strategic planning horizon is so short that you won't take into consideration some of the economic dark clouds that you're suggesting?
Well, in some ways, maybe that bringing in the horizon is not a bad idea. You don't get too far ahead of yourself. So in a time where there's more uncertainty, keeping a short horizon probably makes sense. That way you don't find yourself having committed to plans over 5 or 10 years that you wish you'd not.
That's really interesting. Let's turn to something that I think is more positive, but perhaps you can describe a little more on this. It's my understanding that last year, our sector, the healthcare industry sector, created more jobs than any other industry sector. Is that right? And if so, I think it's right. What are the reasons for it? Why healthcare more than any other sector?
Well, let me give you some statistics. So healthcare created more jobs in 2016. We saw 2.2 million jobs created in the economy. Of those, healthcare added 406,000. So the job growth was heaviest in ambulatory healthcare services, which added 29,700 jobs, followed by hospitals, which added 10,700. Now, we know some of the reasons for this. Not only is the population growing, but particularly those over 65, that segment of the population is growing at the fastest clip of any demographic group. We know that technology right now is going through some quantum jumps, so that's leading to more potential kinds of services and support that the healthcare sector can provide to people. So the demand for healthcare services just continues to grow. And in fact, job creation in healthcare just grew right on through the recession when the economy lost 8 to 9 million jobs in that period between 2008 and 2010. Healthcare continued to add jobs right on through it. So it's been a steady, ongoing growth in the sector and job growth even before ACA, and it's only increased that rate of growth since we've seen the country decide to provide health care for a greater number, or access to health care for a greater number of its citizens.
Before we get into the weeds a little bit on this, I want to go back to a question that I think a lot of our directors listening in today have. Talk to me, if you would, about the relationship between jobs data and strategic planning. In other words, what are the lessons, what is the information, what is the guidance that healthcare directors can expect to glean from jobs data, from trends in the job market, things of that nature? What should they be looking for when they pick up the journal, when they listen to you on television or hear you on the radio? What should they be thinking about in terms of their boardroom responsibilities and the relationship?
Well, jobs is at the core of what's happening in the economy because organizations just don't hire or cut back jobs without reason. No organization likes to go through layoffs. They're always happy to create jobs, but they're careful because of the cost. So when you see jobs data riding through, for example, that recession, we saw it said this is a sector that is withstanding the pressures of the economy. It's a sector on a long-term basis that's just growing in spite of the conditions. So I guess fundamentally, directors should be looking at jobs data as a canary in the coal mine. It tells you what's really happening with the economy and where the areas of growth are and where the declines are. They show up immediately in those numbers.
Let me put you on the spot a little bit here. If you were an advisor to the Finance Committee, for example, is there some data, is there a report, is there something that can be easily accessed that you would want your directors, your committee members to look at in terms of job data on a regular basis? what should we be asking our clients, CFOs, to produce for the Finance Committee in terms of jobs information that you think would be helpful and readily digestible?
The key jobs release is put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Each month, basically the first Friday of each month, they put out a report on what happened in the previous month. So it's really recent, accurate data on where the economy stands. So that unemployment report, and there's always a 3-page summary, and then you can dig into the data and look at what's happening in healthcare, is the number one and first place to go to look at what's happening in the economy, in the labor force, in regard to jobs, in regard to salaries, in regard to who's unemployed. It's the top piece of data to look at.
Actually, you just mentioned something I want to follow up with you. We've been talking about jobs creation. What about job loss, reduction in force? Is there data there that the Finance Committee or the board as a whole should be monitoring? What are the lessons that should be gleaned from industry data on workforce reduction?
There's not too much data. The best data there is put out by states. It's called WARN notifications, and you can get those in your local states. Any organization that has to let go more than 50 people has to file a WARN notice, and so you can look at the data in your state where your facilities are located to get a good feel on what's happening in your local markets.
Some healthcare publications, and there are many publications that come on electronically that are really, really good and provide data, will regularly report on XYZ health system just put through a X% workforce reduction. Is that useful information for a board member, or is it so sporadic or episodic that a board member might take that out of context? How do you view these periodic media reports about the individual institution workforce reductions?
Well, it seems to me you'd like to look at the individual notifications to understand why that hospital or healthcare operation decided to cut jobs. Sometimes you might know someone on one of those boards, and a discussion about why they made that decision might give you information that could cause you to look at your own organization. Maybe they saw something that you didn't, or maybe they're just ahead of the game in that regard. So I think it's certainly valuable to try to understand why organizations are making those cuts. What's leading them to do that? Is it just that they can't get the funding from the government they need? Is it that their technology is outmoded and they're competing against newer hospitals or newer competitors that are providing some kind of service that they're not? So understanding what's leading to those job cuts certainly is a way to get at the issues your organization might be facing.
So perhaps kind of a useful set of materials for the Finance Committee from time to time, if properly evaluated and described?
Sure. Everybody's competing with the same set of conditions, so there's always hospitals, organizations that are the leading ones in their field that are doing everything right, and there's always the ones at the back. Understanding what's making the best organizations succeed and what's causing others, and sometimes even what's causing good organizations to have to go through job cuts, is a real window into what might be happening in the economy and in the marketplace.
John, let's turn back to something you mentioned a few minutes ago. A few weeks ago in Miami, the firm held its annual ambulatory surgery center conference. It's always an extremely popular program, but I guess any excuse to get to Miami in February. But I think the nature of the popularity suggests always to us something about the ambulatory care market. And you had mentioned that the job growth data suggests a real focus on ambulatory care as well. Could you describe that a little more?
Well, we've seen very strong growth there. Right now, there's employed in ambulatory care 7.2 million people. That's up from 6.9 million last year at the same time. So it's a fast-growing area. Certainly, as more and more hospitals move to outpatient kinds of care, ambulatory is only going to grow as home health care. And we're seeing growth in both those areas, significant job growth in both those areas.
Out of curiosity, is there data that shows the sustainability of those new jobs? In other words, once you bring on those positions, is there any data that suggests that they stay with the organization for a long time, or the organization retains that high level of job growth in the area?
Well, certainly hospitals have a vested interest with the low unemployment rate. 4.8% unemployment is almost full employment. Many hospitals are having a very difficult time finding skilled workers. Once you bring workers on, creating an environment where they want to stay, where you can get long tenures or longer tenures from them, giving them development opportunities so that you can train them in your systems is a crucial strategy to maintain your growth. No organization wants to be caught with having to bring on people in a labor market where the pool of people is just very tight right now, who can't really do the job, and then having to train them on the job. There's a long time then getting them up and running. So holding on to your people is crucial strategy right now. And this is only going to get worse. Projection for job growth in the healthcare sector in the next 10 years, we see 1.2 million jobs that should be created in the offices of healthcare practitioners, 826,000 in hospitals, private, state, and local. Home health care up by 716,000. So this demand for healthcare workers is only going to get worse.
One question I want to raise, because you just kind of prompted something in my thinking. As I think you know, corporate board members have an obligation, an increasingly focused obligation for talent, what we call talent development. The obligation to actually take an interest in the executive suite officers other than the CEO, and to help assure their growth and develop with the long-term goal of having a strong, deep executive bench. To what extent do you believe the board members should have an obligation to be even more focused on talent development outside of the executive suite?
So crucial. I mean, hospitals, doctors' offices, the healthcare profession in general is filled with a large number of highly skilled workers. That talent pool is in great demand. Companies all want to capture those people, hold on to them. So looking at your workforce, seeing the demographics of your workforce, seeing the skill levels of that, putting in place development programs to not only upskill those people, but to hold on to them is a big competitive advantage.
John, before we let you go today, I think we're starting to see now the contours of some type of legislative action to repeal and perhaps replace the Affordable Care Act. What does the data tell you? I know this is a very volatile concept and probably will remain so. What does the data tell you, or the forecast, in terms of the impact on healthcare jobs should the Affordable Care Act be repealed with or without some type of immediate replacement? What is your crystal ball telling you?
There have been some studies on this. The Milken Institute came out with a study just recently saying that we could see 2.5 million jobs lost by 2019, 3 million by 2021, if we really see a big pullback in the number of people who are covered.
So in other words, it sounds to me a situation where, in addition to concerns about the general economy and general concerns about the impact on revenues from changes to the Affordable Care Act, there's a job loss issue as well that hospital boards, healthcare system boards are going to need to take into consideration as well.
Well, hospitals are going to have to think about if they've staffed up, do they have the right number of people for perhaps a declining or at least lower than expected amount of revenue, given that there may be pullback in Medicaid payments from the government. It looks like, at least at the moment, that the administration is proposing moving to a tax credits type of scheme instead of direct subsidy for millions of people who are uninsured. Certainly that's going to change the dynamic and could lead to the need for hospitals to think about what parts of their operation did they grow, expand due to ACA that they might now need to pull back in.
John, this has been a fascinating conversation. What would your focused advice be to our client board members, generally speaking, on the relationship to economic issues, job creation, job loss, and their oversight responsibilities on a board agenda that is getting increasingly complex?
Every board member working for a healthcare organization knows that this is a very volatile time. The landscape, the set of regulations that govern healthcare are changing every day, it seems. So this is a time more than ever, especially with the economy maybe near the end of a long expansion, to be vigilant about what is happening in your marketplace, what's happening to your organization. It's not a time for sleepy boards.
John, this has been terrific. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
As John has just told us, there's much that boards and their key committees can learn from economic data that addresses the job market, both the creation and reduction of jobs. It's information that's likely to be of increasing interest to board members, especially as we reach the end of what John referred to as the economy's current growth cycle. An important factor to consider, probably as a quarterly agenda item for the Finance, Strategic Planning, and Human Resources committees. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode of Governing Health. Be sure to subscribe to the full complimentary podcast series. You can find us on iTunes, Pocket Casts, SoundCloud, and YouTube. There you'll be able to stay up to date with all of our future episodes and re-listen to the old ones. Until next time, I'm your host, Michael Peregrine.
Copyright 2017, McDermott, Will & Emery. All rights reserved. Any use of these materials, including reproduction, modification, distribution, or republication without the prior written consent of McDermott, Will & Emery is strictly prohibited. This may be considered attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.